Good evening. Welcome to the Center for Global Humanities and a wonderful event, a much anticipated event by Professor Patricia Limerick. I know a lot of people here were waiting anxiously for this event, so I am just delighted to be able to present her to you. The title of her presentation today is The Uncertain Fate of the Great American Desert, the American West, Water, and the World. But as you know, Professor Limerick has done a lot of work on other areas related to the West, and she may choose to talk about things more broadly or focus on the things she wants to talk about. I gave her the full freedom to decide on how she wants to present tonight, and and she really has license to say anything she wants. Patty Limerick is the faculty director and chair of the board of the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado, where she's also a professor of history. Limerick has dedicated her career to bridging the gap between academics and the general public and to demonstrating the benefits of applying historical perspective to contemporary dilemmas and conflicts. Limerick was born and raised in Banning, California, and graduated from the University of California at Santa Cruz in 1972. Uh, and she received a PhD in American Studies from Yale University in 1980. And from 1980 to 1984, she was an assistant professor of history at Harvard. In 1984, Limerick moved to Boulder to join the history department of the University of Colorado, where she was promoted to tenured associate professor in 1987 and to full professor in 1991. In 1985, she published Desert Passages, followed in 1987 by her best-known work, The Legacy of Conquest, an overview and reinterpretation of Western American history that has stirred up a great deal of both academic and public debate. Limerick is also a prolific essayist, and many of her most notable articles, including Dancing with Professors, The Trouble with Academic Prose, were collected in 2000 under the title Something in the Soil. Limerick has received a number of awards and honors recognizing the impact of her scholarship and her commitment to teaching, including the MacArthur Fellowship 1995 to 2000, and the Hazel Barnes Prize, the University of Colorado's highest award for teaching and research in 2001. She has served as president of several professional organizations, advised documentary and film projects, and done 2 tours as a Pulitzer nonfiction jurist. She regularly engages the public on the op-ed pages of local and national newspapers, and in the summer of 2005, she served as a guest columnist for the New York Times. Limerick is also known as an energetic, funny, and engaging public speaker, and I'm sure you'll get that impression very shortly, sought after by a wide range of Western constituencies that include private industry groups, state and federal agencies, and grassroots organizations. In 1986, Limerick and Colorado University law professor Charles Wilkinson founded the Center of the American West, and since 1995, it has been her primary point of affiliation. During her tenure, the Center has published a number of books, including the influential Atlas of the New West, published in 1997, and a series of lively, balanced, and to-the-point reports on compelling Western issues, including what every Westerner should know about energy. In 2003, Cleaning Up Hard Rock Abandoned Mines, 2006, and What Every Westerner Should Know About Energy Efficiency and Conservation, 2007. Limerick and Center staff are currently working on several projects, including a book about the role of the Department of Interior in the West based on the Inside Interior series of interviews hosted by the Center between 2004 and 2006, an illustrated history of Denver Water Board, and a PBS series titled The Lover's Guide to the West. And under her leadership, the Center of the American West serves as a forum committed to the civil, respectful, problem-solving exploration of important, often contentious public issues. In an era of political polarization and contention, the Center strives to bring out, my script goes missing here, but the best, the best, the better angels of our nature. By the way, she's also currently the vice president of the teaching division of the American Historical Association. In 2014, She will be the president of the Organization of American Historians. And this year she was the chair of the Pulitzer jury for history. And in 2013, among the many things, accomplishments, and duties that come her way, she will be president of the Society of American Historians. This is only an abbreviated biography of this very incredibly accomplished person, and I cannot be more delighted of introducing her to you tonight.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Anwar Majid and the faculty and students associated with the Center for Global Humanities and the members of the public who are here and also affiliated with that center. My life has taken kind of a strange turn in the last 10 years, where I used to be writing most of the time about the big picture of Western American history, and people find that to be romantic and interesting. So if I went to a reception or cocktail party and said I was writing about the history of the American West, people liked that and wanted to chat. And then life took a strange turn, and I spend a fair amount of my time now writing about bureaucracy and infrastructure, which does not have the same effect at a reception or a cocktail party, and sends people off saying, oh, now there's a friend I haven't seen in ages over on the other side of the room. So that made me think, 3 weeks ago I went to see the ophthalmologist, and I said I thought that I needed to have my glasses prescription toughened up because I would seem to be losing a little bit of precision in eyesight. And the ophthalmologist, who's quite young and who doesn't really seem to be specializing in bedside manner, he said, excuse me, I just had that bad moment for a speaker here, which kind of will prove my point when I make it. Water was the topic, but okay, so the ophthalmologist said he wanted to reassure me that I was not in the bad state I thought I was, and he said, as he left, he said, pardon me, it's very funny, it's a problem, but he said, you're not deteriorating as quickly as you think. Although that's not true, as you can see now, I'm deteriorating very rapidly. So I'm just going to do one great gulp here and go past this one. Okay, so that is a little bit of my theme tonight, is that there was a time when I worked on this bigger scale of the American West, and I will just briefly tell you the 4 main points that I took up to rethink the history of the American West, now 25 years ago. And those 4 themes had the advantage of beginning with 4 words beginning with C, so they could be remembered easily, and they, somewhat humorously, they came from an occasion where the editor of People magazine assigned a reporter to come do a story about me and my views, which was kind of piggybacking on Dances with Wolves, the movie that had just come out then. So People magazine sent a reporter and a photographer, and the photographer did what East Coast photographers always do to a person who writes about the West. He insisted that I put on a fringed leather jacket, which I own, and a cowboy hat, with me saying, I really rarely wear these, but no, I have to wear those. And then the Eastern photographer, well, all of them, generically, have to require you to go out and sit on a rock for your photograph. And even when you say, I rarely go out and sit on rocks, they say, well, here is a rock. And so if you see this People magazine from 1990, there I am in a cowboy hat, fringed jacket, and on a rock. But what was a huge blessing was that in People magazine, you cannot be a long-winded academic. You have to get to the point. So the reporter forced me to take a 350-page book and turn it into 4 words beginning with C. So we are beneficiaries, not of the photographer so much, but of the reporter. So here are the 4 C words. First, convergence. Instead of seeing the West as a place where the primary story was the westward movement of white folks, we would see it as it actually had been, a place of convergence of Indian people who had been there for a long time before, Indian people displaced from the eastern United States and removed into the West, northward moving Spanish and Mexican people, eastward moving Asian people crossing the oceans and heading into the Pacific coast, and French Canadians coming sort of south and west, Russians in Alaska, the Pacific coast. So that convergence of people literally starting from all over the planet, that I thought and think was a much more accurate way of writing the history of the West and understanding it. Of course, the white folks coming from the eastern United States, that was a very important set of stories, and the European immigrants coming from Europe, very important. But in this larger reaction of people coming from so many different points of origin. The second C, continuity. 25 years ago, Western historians had a funny habit of saying that the frontier was really the West was the frontier, and the main reason to pay attention to the American West was to see the frontier movement. And the funny habit was then to say that that ended in 1890. That as of 1890, there were no major areas of unsettled terrain. So Western history, as it mattered to national history, ostensibly then came to a halt in 1890, which didn't seem like a great idea to say to other historians and to say to the American public, we have no relevance today. Anything that you might be interested in, that's really quite a while ago. So, and in fact, that was not a good thing to say for various reasons of public engagement, but also because nearly every issue, I guess I would say every issue, that was contested and struggled over in the 19th century, those issues were still struggled over in the 20th century and into the 21st century, whether those were matters of Indian land claims, Indian water rights, Indian religious freedom, matters of resource development and the proper way to go about extracting minerals. All of those issues were still very much unsettled and very much struggled over. What had changed, which I think is really quite good news, it had gone from battlefields to courtrooms. So when people today say, oh, we're too litigious, we spend too much time in court, you think, well, try a battlefield if you would like to feel better about lawyers. I don't know, there may be one or two lawyers here, and that was not a lawyer joke, that was a lawyer affirmation and lawyer appreciation. The third C should be obvious, but wasn't, and still may not be in some circles, complexity. That the American West, its peoples, its history has the same story of complexity of individuals, of groups, of telling good guys from bad guys. That is a fact of the American West, but it's a hard fact for people to face up because the movies, the dime novels before that had told so many wonderful, persuasive, charming, engaging, and clear stories about telling good guys from bad guys and always being able to separate those. So to say that the American West had the same level of complexity as any other part of the planet hardly seems very insightful or original, but still seemed necessary to say. Back in the days when I was working on this, I conducted I guess you could call it an opinion poll. I would ask people who work with the American public, waiters and cab drivers and so on, I'd ask them what percentage of the American public is composed of jerks. And they seemed to be in places where they would have a good, solid answer. Strangely, that it was like between 5 and 15% was the usual estimate, with some variation. One man, the man who installed our heater, we needed a new heater, he said that it was 90%. I think he may be skewing that sample a little bit. He may be the person who brought that out a little bit and others. And then my favorite person was a cab driver in Washington. Another car had just zipped in front of us and cut him off. And so I thought, well, this is a good time to ask the question. So I said, what percentage are composed of jerks? And he said, 5%. I said, boy, that's really much lower than usual. I said, that guy who just came in front of us, there's one. And he said, well, 5%, but they move around a lot. So complexity, to recognize that percentage, the 5 to 15%, in individuals and communities and groups, that if you're trying to get somebody who will be 100% hero, you're on the wrong planet for that. That to have that recognition of complexity was, in fact, the most basic way of respecting the human beings of Western history and of the Western present. And then the fourth C, conquest. This one is a little, I don't know if it's arcane, but the word frontier was the word that Western historians used. I thought it was a fuzzy term. I couldn't find a definition that ever satisfied me for what that was. And the main problem with it is actually a Center for Global Humanities issue and topic here, because the pattern among historians and probably many people in the general public, people in government, was to think the American West was very different from the history of the rest of the planet, so that the movement of Europeans out of Europe into almost every other part of the planet, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Latin America, that was a process of invasion and conquest, of Europeans going where they had not been before, and when the dust settled, they had more power and resources than the indigenous people who had been there. So the word frontier, I thought, was troubling because it exempted the United States from that big global story. And it didn't help our self-knowledge to say South Africa had an invasion and a conquest, Kenya had an invasion and a conquest, and so on, but the American West had an expanding frontier of democracy and self-government and opportunity. That's not really a way to know who we are and where we came from. So it seemed important to insert the word conquest where the word frontier had been and to see the reality of that exercise of power. Okay, so that's me, the Western historian. For a spell, the Young Turk stirring things up. It was quite a feisty period 25 years ago where I was not universally popular in the field of Western history, and I enjoyed that very much. And I love arguing and debating, and that was really fun. I wouldn't have missed that. But over time, I started to think, I'm not sure I'm getting as much yardage out of that as I might like. I enjoyed the squabbling very fully. And then I began to wonder about my techniques and methods of communication. So, plus, I had gone really overnight from being a rebellious young Turk to being an established old bird. And young folks, I will warn you, that can just sneak up on you. And it's not, I mean, it's good, I guess, but it doesn't really feel good at the start of that. So I had become orthodoxy there in a way that was not in my plans. So various things, I just thought this is time to be rethinking some of my customs. So over the last 15 or 20 years, I have shifted from being controversial and contentious to being congenial and collaborative. And this has been a grave disappointment to quite a few people who just think, oh, you were so much more interesting before you were a Rotarian. So, and I am a proud Rotarian. My attendance is not great. I missed Rotary to get here, didn't I? No, I didn't. No, I can't blame you for that. No, I didn't miss sorry, but attendance is bad. Though that is a global humanities project in itself, Rotary. So, okay, so I will say then, as I get now to this issue of the Great American Desert and West and water, which will focus in ways in my home territory, because that's another aspect of my life, is that I tried to pay more attention to where I was living and the people around me, and to write things that would have bearing on their lives and speak to them on things that had bearing on their lives. So that will be why we're spending a fair amount of time on the Front Range of Colorado in this talk. So I will say, though, that if I had taken up this project on the history of water in the area in which I live now, in the Denver area, if I had taken that up 25 years ago, I suspect I would have reached a much more simple interpretation. The history of water in Denver I would have found to be a prime example of conquest at its most dominating and inflexible. A bunch of outsiders, invaders, intruders come into an area they refuse to see and to accept the dryness of that area, the high rate of evaporation, the low rate of precipitation. They go into denial, they fight that, they're determined to impose their will on nature, and they never give a thought to the idea that they might adapt to where they are. So I probably 25 years ago would have said, well, there it is. There's the legacy of conquest in its clearest terms. Instead, it seems to me that that's not the angle that you'll see tonight. In fact, that may be more evidence that I am deteriorating. You may discover that there's not the sharp edge of critique of the ways in which the settlers reconfigured the arrangements and allocation of water, were determined to replace the natural landscape with the green landscapes and the agriculture they remembered from the eastern United States and the Midwest, the ways in which they seized resources in an imperial manner. Well, that's not particularly my angle now. In fact, I think you'll see a maybe disturbing sympathy with and sometimes even appreciation of the forces that I once denounced as the conquerors. So that is something for you to think about over the next half hour, is to join the ophthalmologist in appraising my deterioration and what you might think of this shift to congeniality and collaboration. So here we go. This is what we'll be drawing on. This is a book that is just like a week or two from going off to the publishers. It's got the clever name of, we had the dullest names on the planet, prepared for it, but then my husband asked me what it was really about, and I said, well, it's really about how Denver's leaders tried to look ahead and prepare for scarcity and avoid scarcity. So a stitch in time, and then he said, a ditch in time. So stitch in time prevents 9. Well, a ditch in time prevents an empty faucet, I guess would be the way to do that. This is a kind of an interesting personal moment for me because after The Legacy of Conquest came out, I wrote essays. I did not write one book on one subject. There are I know a lot of people who wrote a successful book, and that was the last heard of them for a long spell. So I'm a little bit amused to discover that I'm back in the book world. I think Denver is a really important case study because as a Californian, I'm entitled to say too much of the history of Western water has been written about California, and Los Angeles and San Francisco have been the hogs of attention in the spotlight. Well, hogs is not a very flattering term, but they have received a lot of attention, and they have been, especially Los Angeles, has been the source of a dominant image of Western water development that comes from that very powerful movie Chinatown, which a number of people have seen, in which the developers of water are just the wickedest things around. They're very brutal and very cruel people. And that notion of an imperial power using every cruel method to achieve its water claims, I don't think that's the story of Denver water. As opposed to imperial power, it's a story of fragmentation. It's a story of lots of different aspiring empires competing with each other and not succeeding in becoming the one dominant empire. My friend Don Worster wrote a book on Western water called Rivers of Empire, and after working on this project, I don't see that. I see Rivers of Contesting Fragmented Power, which is a terrible title, but more accurate, I think, than Rivers of Empire. It is impossible for me now to arrange this in a plot pitting good guys against bad guys, and that, I think, makes it a more typical and representative story. It is not good material for someone who wanted to make a scary movie about wicked folks. Okay, so now to our big question. This is an orthodoxy and is in many people's minds still in that status that the American West is made distinctive by its scarcity of precipitation and the sparseness of its flow in rivers, especially in midsummer and late summer. There have been many important contributors to this idea. Here's what I consider probably the principal ones. We'll talk in a moment about Zebulon Pike and Stephen Long, two explorers of the plains and originators of the idea of the West as a great American desert. John Wesley Powell, who wrote wonderfully in the 1860s and 1870s about the dry Western landscape and the need to think ahead in water allocation. Wallace Stegner, the great writer of the mid and late 20th century, who wrote in most memorable and quotable ways about the limits set on human activity by the water supply, or the scarcity of that supply. And then, of course, Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire. So lots of important thinkers who installed in our mind very quotable sentences and paragraphs and essays that come off from this basic hydrographic, or that's not a hydrographic anyway, but a basic graph on their mapping of the average annual precipitation in the West. So the darker the area, the heavier the rainfall. The lighter the area, the lighter the rainfall, and that is not a subtle map. If anyone is having trouble interpreting that, you should go see my ophthalmologist, because this is pretty clear what's going on here. Of course, the Pacific Coast, Washington State, and Oregon State along the coast, they are not meeting this standard for westernness, but otherwise, it's not hard to see why people thought the American West was a distinctive place. And this does not include evaporation, because evaporation with the sunlight and the rarity of cloud cover is a very significant factor in lessening the water supply. Now, here are two guys who are very influential as interpreters of the Great American Desert, well, really coiners of the very concept, and they are worth a moment of our attention here because they were the source of this idea that the West would have to be very different from conventional American settlement. It would create a different pattern. Zebulon Pike was traveling across the plains into the Front Range of Colorado in 1806, and then Stephen Long, who came to that area in 1819, the chronicler for the Stephen Long expedition was a doctor named Edwin James. So Zebulon Pike in 1806, Stephen Long and Edwin James in 1819 had very clear impressions of what nature in the American West was going to mean for American settlement. And basically what it was going to mean was a giant stop sign, a stay out, no trespassing sign to American settlement. So both Zebulon Pike and Stephen Long and his chronicler Edwin James came to a very firm conclusion that the lack of water, the comparative scarcity of water in the American West, was going to require Americans to make other plans to stay out. And here's the surprise. They actually thought that was pretty good news. Now that's an important thing to remember because our idea of 19th century white Westerners is quite cliched, that they were just expansion advocates in a uniform, standardized way. The manifest destiny idea from later in the century we seem to have really exaggerated how much that was the characteristic of their mind. So Zebulon Pike and Stephen Long truly found this to be good news, that the West was dry. Why did they find it good news? Well, think about the timing there, 1806, not long, just a couple of decades after the Constitution, well, not even 2 decades from the Constitution, American Revolution, very fresh, the whole experiment of a representative democracy, very much up in the air, how that will work. No one in 1806 could have had any idea of how to answer the question, how big can a democratic republic be before it is too big? At what point will you have extended through space to where it is no longer manageable as an experiment where people vote for their representatives and trust those representatives? So for Pike and Long, the good news was, whew, this will actually solve that problem. Instead of overextending the nation and pushing it past its limits of a manageable size, here is our limit. So here is Zebulon Pike's very quotable phrasing. From these immense prairies may arise one great advantage to the United States, the restriction on our population to some certain limits, and here's the key phrase, and thereby a continuation of the Union. So here's a man who thought, if this gets too big, we'll lose it. Here. So a continuation of the Union, our citizens being so prone to rambling, that's true, and extending themselves on the frontier, will through necessity be constrained to limit their extent on the West. So, it's such an interesting surprise to see how happy he was about this. And then here's the second great advantage he saw. While they leave the prairies incapable of cultivation to the wandering and uncivilized aborigines of the country. So the solution to the Indian problem, white folks will not want this area, we can put the Indians here. Stephen Long basically agreed on all these accounts. The area Edwin James wrote for the behalf of the Long expedition, this area would prove of infinite importance to the United States inasmuch as it is calculated to serve as a barrier to prevent too great an extension of our population westward. Well, okay, so here we have the prophecy. Here we have come upon an area which finally by the 1830s was being mapped as the Great American Desert, the plains as a unit made into the Great American Desert. Pike and Long, full of confidence in their prediction and missing one or two factors. The major one, human ingenuity. Very much underestimating what human ingenuity would do, which is going to be the next part of our story. So here we get to see how poorly their prophecy has worked out over time. The darker the area here, the heavier the use of water. This is gallons per day, per person per day water consumption in 1990. Not dramatic, a little bit changed, but not dramatically changed since then. So the areas that had the least naturally present water are the areas of the heaviest per capita use. That doesn't make Pike and Long look so clever at this stage. Anybody who's ever engaged in prophecy or prediction knows that's just an average performance for a. But so why was that happening? This is a really important. This is from our Atlas of the New West. This is the green column. Green part of the column is the water going to agriculture by state, and the blue part is the water going to municipal and industrial uses by state. So the Jeffersonian agrarian dream, kind of an abstraction. Seems like it's an abstraction. There is the Jeffersonian agrarian dream and material reality. This enormous commitment on the part of Americans to capture the spring runoffs, store those spring runoffs, and make them available during the growing season in order to replicate conventional American agriculture in the West. So people who say we're running out of water need to say the next thing of where is the water going? If we wanted to move water from agriculture to municipal and industrial uses, the party is far from over if we want to do that. There's no reason to think that we do. But nature is not going to decree whether the water goes to agriculture or goes to cities. Now, when you look at that, you notice that maybe with the exception of California, though even that's kind of tiny, the cities are not the major users of water in this by a long shot. So when people, for instance, get angry at Denver Water and accuse Denver Water, well, some people really will make it sound as if Denver Water is the major source of the water problem in Colorado, our major problem in dealing with the limits of water. Look at Colorado there, just closest to me. How could Denver be the major source of that problem when it's just that tiny little cap at the top? Okay, now you have an ordeal. You have to know that. We're going to quickly look at this map, which is the Denver Water Diversion System. And you're not going to have to spend too much time on this because this could be the rest of the evening, just walking us through these structures and details. You'll want to look at the Continental Divide. The elk is there, standing next to the sign that says Continental Divide. That's our special Center of the American West elk there. And so you can see that not straight line of the Continental Divide. This side is the Front Range. That side is the western slope of Colorado. 80% of the water falls on and runs in the streams of the western slope and goes into the Colorado River drainage. The Front Range, the major river there is the South Platte River, which is, actually, I could read this right there. So the major Front Range water supply comes from the South Platte River and into, actually where the silly-looking gentleman who's fishing, his fishing rod is fishing line is pointing to Cheeseman Reservoir, the first major project of Denver Water. So that you'll want to pay attention to that Continental Divide, and then you'll want to notice that there's a southern and a northern system for Denver Water. There are two major tunnels taking water from the western slope to the Front Range. The first one, just kind of in the center there, Roberts Tunnel, that is from the 1960s, early 1960s. That is key to the southern system, which also includes the natural drainage of the South Platte River. And then if you go far to the north, the top of the map, beneath the phrase Continental Divide, you'll see Moffett Tunnel. That's from the 1930s, and that was the first major transbasin diversion that Denver Water did from the western slope. If you were responding, as many people do, you'll have started to think, well, is that fair for the Front Range to take the water from the western slope? Is that right or proper? And so it is important to tell you right at the start that the Colorado Constitution of 1876 provides no protection to the basin of origin. So you may think, well, that's not a good way to treat your neighbors in your state, but there is nothing in the Colorado Constitution that says that the basin of origin, where the water was naturally flowing, has any legal right or preference. The only question under the doctrine of prior appropriation is who made the claim first. If Denver Water sent agents to the western slope and claimed water rights before anybody else did, those are senior rights, and those rights carry standing. A junior right, a younger right, will be filled only if there's sufficient water for both junior and senior rights. So whatever we might think about whether it is fair to the trout on the western slope, the Colorado Constitution does not have any recognition of that. Okay. Can we stop now with this tedious map and go on? Okay. So now one more round of, I hope not tedium, but just a quick chronological race through this book and its historical story. So chapter 1, Engineered Eden, is a story of the origins of Denver, the Colorado Pikes Peak Gold Rush, 1858, 1859, with Denver founded. as the miners came through and as merchants reached the recognition that everyone reaches in a gold rush, which is it's an awful lot of trouble to go into the mountains and engage in mining, and it's much more pleasant to be a merchant and sell things to the miners. So if you were hoping to make a fortune and you don't want to be in the mountains and isolated camps in the winter, then settling in Denver and being a merchant is a much better plan. Denver, as you can see from this landscape, did not strike people as wooded and engaging and pleasant. There was a story that I think sums up a lot of everyone's perception, American settlers' perception of the Denver landscape. This was a story of in 1863, just 4 years after Denver's founding, a visiting Presbyterian minister had come and was giving a guest sermon at a church and was suddenly overcome from the experience of traveling in and seeing Denver, seeing the great American desert on his way there. He was overcome by the urge to have the congregation sing a hymn entitled, "Lord, what a wretched land is this." So we could go on with more examples of that, but that is a pretty common impression of, oh no, it's like Pike and Long, how could people live here? And the response to that was an extraordinary effort to replicate the landscapes of the eastern United States and an extraordinary testimony to the cultural power of the color green. So here is the city, again, just really rather a brief time after its founding, conventional urban areas, but also a very strong commitment to landscaping, so that by 1890, these sorts of locales were causing travel writers, visitors, promoters to say, this is a city of gardens, a city of lawns and gardens. All of that is testimony to the activity going into creating these private companies. But the private companies competed like fiends against each other, duplicated each other's efforts, got in each other's way. And so Chapter 2 involves the consolidation of the companies into the Denver Union Water Company, and the Denver Union Water Company recognizing that something had to change in their arrangements because there were too many people living in Denver right next to the rivers and streams, to the South Platte and Cherry Creek, so that it was essential for public health to go up into the mountains, to go up into the Front Range, staying on the Front Range side, not going to the western slope, and put a dam in the South Platte River so that water, pure water, water that had not been contaminated by association with American settlement, would be available for the city. So this chapter, the two parallel projects of going into the mountains and building a very major dam, which you'll see in a moment, and the creation, and also a very big project, the creation of the Denver Water Department. It took much longer to create a new civic institution than it took to build a very big, very complicated dam, and that, I think, tells us something about material reality and human political reality. So Cheeseman Dam was created by the Denver Union Water Company while it was still a private company, and then this longer process of creating an entity, a water board that is, the members are appointed by the mayor but cannot be removed by the mayor and cannot be ordered around by the mayor, so it is politically independent of the city government, of the mayor and the city council. Okay, so here's the Denver Union Water Company coming together in 1894. Here's the kind of sprightliness that the company could operate with because they did not need citizen support. They had just one or two tiny land claims with the federal government to deal with, very different from the laborious project of building the Owens Valley diversion in Los Angeles or the Hetch Hetchy Dam. So here is a place, like is so often the case in the West, this is looking like it wants to be a reservoir, right? Because it's like a bathtub just waiting for one side to be filled in there. So a perfect steep walls, and if you plug it, you will have a reservoir. So 1899, they pitch in and they start building away. It's a remote location, an incredible project to get supplies and men into the area. They work away, they work for a year, and then they have a heavy spring flood. And a year's worth of work was basically devastated. You can see this does not look like a well-managed construction site. So a year into their work, they lost most of the results of their labors. They were very efficient and sent runners, or rather horseback riders, down the river to warn people so no one was killed when the flood came through from this. So, okay, so there it's gone. Now the plan, the design seemed not workable if the first strong runoff that came through took it down. And I don't know how you can avoid being impressed by this. in months, they had redesigned the dam, and they started in again. Now, if we had a calamity like this, I don't know what, 70 years later, after the litigation had been settled and the compensation paid and the companies had stopped suing each other, we might start in again. But they started in right away, and here is Cheeseman Dam coming along very fast. I'm sad to say that when you visit these sites and you stand next to these outflow valves, even though you're a mentally healthy person, if you stand too close to these things where just water with incredible power is coming out, you are tempted to jump in. Yeah. And that does not make any sense. I'm not suicidal, but you just think, I need to back away from this. There's something so seductive and magnetic about it. It's just weird. So when I've only said this to a couple of other audiences, but privately, half of the people will usually admit that they think, yeah, that would be incredible. But no, it wouldn't be. It would be bad. It would be very bad. So here's Cheeseman Dam. I've visited Cheeseman Dam, and it is really a very beautiful structure. This is the National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark, and yet standing there looking at that, I thought, boy, you wonder why the National Endowment for the Arts or the National Endowment for the Humanities hasn't given it a similar prize. So here's just to show you how far I have shifted from the old author of The Legacy of Conquest. I thought, boy, this just looks so much like some of the things that we hear so much about. Here's Cheeseman Dam. Look at that curve. It's an arch dam. It's really very striking. And then we have these things, which are called art. This is the famous Robert Smithson's spiral jetty in Salt Lake, and this is a thing that is called land art and is admired and given awards to. Here's the one that's now much disputed, whether we'll have at the Arkansas River. This Christo will put one of his famous curtains, or I don't know what carpets, I don't know what it's called, but in any case, so these are called land art. So I actually thought, well, why not that? If it's a matter of human artistry, this strikes me as really the same category. So I went and read things about land art, and we have these interesting, I'll just give you a couple of quotations from art critics explaining what land art is. The range of art referred to as land art and environmental art includes site-specific cultural projects that utilize the materials of the environment to create new forms or to adjust our impressions of the panorama, programs that import new unnatural objects into the natural setting. In its first manifestations, the genre was one of diesel and dust, populated by hard-hat-minded men finding their identities away from the comforts of the cultural center, digging holes and blasting cuts through cliff sides, recasting the land with masculine disregard for the longer term. Well, so, I mean, that just, the way that thing is sculpted into the land, it's beautiful. Now, I was not planning 30 years ago to stand at the base of this kind of structure and say, that's beautiful. I don't know how you can avoid it. I'm sorry. I'm so impure. I'm so contaminated now with that. But there we are. I started to speculate. Maybe the people at the turn of the century, those very influential professional engineers who were reshaping the planet, not just the American West, and some of the same people who worked in the West worked internationally, Australia and other places, maybe they were just frustrated artists. Maybe they were people who knew they would not get funding if they said they had an exciting new thing called land art, but that they could get money if they said they were building water diversion structures or storage structures. So that's a not highly regarded hypothesis, but in any case, that's okay. Chapter 3, moving along here. So here we shift in the 1930s to the diversions from the western slope. Again, not prohibited by the Colorado Constitution, but the first tunnel, the Moffett Tunnel, that Denver Water did, quite an enormous undertaking to have a tunnel running underneath the Rockies. Here the water comes out. And then once you have moved it to the Front Range, then you can't just take the water from the western slope, put it into the Front Range rivers, and send it to Nebraska. That's not any good. It might be nice for the people in Nebraska, but that can't be the point. So you have to store it on the Front Range. So this is a dam, the Gross Dam, one of the first, well, really the first big dam to store water brought from the western slope into the Front Range and to keep it, this is in Boulder County, to keep it where it could be held until the citizens of Denver could use it. This phrase, a horrifying jigsaw puzzle, is a phrase quoted from the Denver Post about the incredible negotiations, legal negotiations, very elaborate, very complicated negotiations that by the 1950s were characterizing the projects of water development in Colorado and throughout the West. This is my poem, this is my limerick, about how incredibly hard it is to follow and read these things. Limericks are best allowed, I think. If you study Blue River decrees, you will soon grow weak in the knees. Say you're fit as a fiddle, this stipulated riddle will soon make you totter and wheeze, which happens to be true. So that, two big provisions, these were in 1955 and 1964, giant negotiations, very elaborate negotiations between the Front Range, the water supplier, well, the people on the western slope, the counties involved, the water development agencies on the western slope. So very difficult to track. But here's the story. The growth of Denver after World War II is making the leadership of Denver Water panicked over what will happen if this growth continues and they do not have an enhanced supply. And here's the Roberts Tunnel, the second big diversion tunnel. This again is the one a little bit more to the south of the Moffett Tunnel. The Blue River, the subject of these complicated negotiations, channeled then through the Roberts Tunnel into the Front Range. Happy people. They claim that this was the longest water diversion tunnel at its time. I'm not totally sure if that's true internationally, but apparently in the United States that was the longest. And here's Dillon Dam that stores Blue River water on the western slope and then releases it into Roberts. Okay, then we have, we're coming close to the end of this summary, a chapter on the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s when Denver Water finally had to confront the rise of the environmental movement and the passage of environmental laws by the federal government, by Congress. So that turns out to be a very game-changing experience, which Denver Water did not get. The leaders were so used to getting what they wanted, even when they went through complicated negotiations like the Blue River decrees, that they charged into the 1960s and 1970s, planning a new treatment plant, the Foothills treatment plant, planning a new Front Range storage thing, thinking that they would get somewhere. When we look back at them, we think these were kind of thick-witted people, but really their experience was if you stay on the game, if you keep pushing, you'll get what you want. So it's a really wonderful moment to think how, in hindsight, things are so clear to us at that time. No wonder they thought they could get through there. So here's very dramatic growth. The paradox here I want to bring to your attention for a moment. Why is Denver growing so fast? Because it has the largest population of federal employees outside of Washington, D.C. Most of the federal agencies have a very big base at the Federal Center in south of Denver. So the federal government and its growth of agencies is powering the growth of the Denver population, and paradoxically, the federal government and its growth of powers is then obstructing Denver in its attempts to get the water for those people. So here is the plan for the Two Forks Dam that occupied the 1980s. This is back on the South Platte River, just upriver from Cheeseman Dam. The goal here is to increase diversion from the western slope, but to have a place, another very big reservoir to hold that water on the Front Range so it doesn't get released to no benefit of the people in the city and instead just goes down the South Platte into the Plain States. So here's Denver Water's proud plan. Unusual consortium between the suburbs and the city. The suburbs were part of this whole thing. We're putting in 80% of the expenses and we're going to get 80% of the water. Kind of an interesting suburb-city collaboration, but oh no. The federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency under George Herbert Walker Bush vetoed the project. The leaders of Denver Water were just not for a loop. They could not understand how they could have met a force that had said no. So that brings us to a really, and I would say actually for the purposes of this book, the Echo Park Dam controversy in Dinosaur National Monument in the 1950s is very famous in American environmental history. I think this is the more consequential decision Echo Park was going to be, the dam was going to be in a national monument under the National Park Service. This was not in that sort of protected land. It was BLM and Forest Service land or private property. So this is the more consequential story, that the big dams are really going to have a very hard time getting permitted. So I think a bigger story than the Echo Park. And then our last chapter here, what was going to happen after Two Forks. It was just an amazing moment of institutional change to see an agency that had proceeded in one direction for decades brought to a halt. And it was a kind of a cliffhanger moment. What is going to become of an agency that faces such a shift? A man named Chip Sperry was appointed as the Denver water manager. His personality was such that he really was not interested in putting more effort into pushing past other people's objections. He shifted Denver Water from litigating, suing everybody in sight, to collaborating and trying to build agreements. He shifted to demand management or conservation to try to get the citizens of Denver to use much less water. In fact, that was a very significant, probably 20% drop in consumption from his efforts. And then he decided he did feel that they needed to strengthen the northern system because of the drought, terrible drought in 2002. So he did propose one more expansion of diversion from the western slope, but he initiated a process of negotiation, collaboration, which led to the announcement of this agreement in 2011 between the western slope and Denver Water, an astonishing agreement in which Denver Water says they will never do another project unless they have the consent of the western slope counties and agencies. It's really an amazing shift from what they used to be. Here is a man named Glenn Saunders, who was the lead counsel for Denver Water and who was the feistiest thing on the planet. He used to love suing people. I was going to spare you this, but I want to convey Glenn Saunders' temperament to you. He was the face and voice and force of Denver Water for years, and you need to know a little bit about what Glenn Saunders was like as a person to understand how astonishing this change is. Here's some passages from a affidavit. Glenn Saunders was doing a deposition. And here, they got on the subject, I don't know how this happened, but they got on the subject of whether how Indians figured in Glenn Saunders' mind. He had basically said that he didn't think anybody who hadn't been born in Colorado had a right to make decisions about Colorado. So the attorney says to him, "Did the Indians require a permit from your ancestors to settle in Colorado?" Glenn Saunders: "No, we killed them off and conquered them because we were stronger and more aggressive, and if they rise again, I'm willing to do that again." I forgot to tell you, this is from the early 1970s. This is not from the 1870s, this is the 1970s. The attorney: "So your property rights are superior because of your ability to conquer?" Saunders: "My ability to conquer derives from my superior intellect and physique." This is exactly right, the same as your folks. "That is why we are here. We are superior people, and we should be proud of it and use it well. And I am not ashamed of being superior to some of the people I have seen in this world." So that was Glenn Saunders, and I could give you more examples. And this is Chip Sperry, who took over as the manager and who had the most congenial and different temperament and approach. Very humorous, very good-natured man. So that is quite a shift. Now, we come to the conclusions that I want to very quickly review some of the ideas that came into my mind from working on this project. These are misapprehensions that I now, I guess, repent or regret or don't fully sign on to, and yet many of them are still in people's minds. I'll just go really quickly through these. The misapprehension is here in the italics, and then the question that now carries more force for me is at the bottom. So really, in all, this is just an idea you can find in many, many circles, that the amount of water that a population has or an area has in the West will determine the rate of growth and residential development in that area. If you want to increase population growth and residential land development, you add water. If you want to limit population growth and residential land development, you stop adding water. I believe that. I had heard many, many environmentalists say that water sets a carrying capacity in the West. Very much just like mule deers and prairie dogs. There's so much water, there are so many organisms. Well, prairie dogs and mule deer don't go to engineering school. Very big difference. And the carrying capacity thing, really, it's suspended when you have the engineers in there building these structures. Plus, there are many, many factors that influence growth. My friend Dan Lukey, who's a hydrologist there, remarks in a passage in the book, you can't stimulate growth by supplying water, nor can you prevent it by constraining access to water, in part because there are always options of ways that you allocate the water, and in part because water is not a very expensive commodity. You can stimulate or prevent growth with transportation, you can do it with institutions of higher education, you can do it with airports, you can do it with social services, but you can't do it with water. So I used to think it was a causal connection between water and population growth. I think it's now more casual than causal. Second, and very closely connected to that, I used to think, as many people in the state of Colorado still think, that Denver Water could control growth in the Front Range if their leaders would just face up to the responsibilities. I now have a much greater respect for the limits on Denver Water. They have a charter mandate. The first mandate of their charter, which was from 1918, is that they must supply adequate water to the people in their service area. That's their mandate. There's nothing that says you must exhort citizens to better behavior, you must tell them to think in long-range terms about posterity. That responsibility is on legislatures and county commissions and city councils. They are the ones who have jurisdiction over land use planning and that future. The water suppliers, I don't think, have that. I used to think that urban and rural interests were very distinct. I now have a much stronger sense of how intertwined the well-being of rural areas and well-being of urban areas are. I'm struck by how long Thomas Jefferson has been not retiring, so that his dreams of the value of agriculture as a more virtuous, more moral, more productive of good citizens way of life, how strong those ideas still are in many of our minds, and how his dreadful statements about cities are the cankers on the body politic, the sores on the body politic, those ideas shaped me in thinking that the city was an intrinsically wicked user of water and farmers were more virtuous. Well, I don't have that idea, but I do have a very strong recognition, and again, the international water writers have brought this to my attention, that every time fruits and vegetables and grain move from rural areas into a city, water moves with them, water that produced them as part of that transaction. So separating, people move to Denver, Colorado because it has beautiful open spaces in its vicinity. It has beautiful open spaces because it has ranch lands and farmlands. That's a very big part of that. So how we separate those, well, we can, I think, go to recognize their intertwinedness. I used to think that the engineers were the sources of our trouble. I used to be a classic technology basher, and now I've recognized, I think, that we have had a unhappy relationship and a not well thought out relationship with engineers, where we have said basically over 150 years, we have said to engineers, get us everything we want, get us every commodity, every service, and we want to have it the moment we want it. We want to turn the switch and get the electricity. We want to turn the faucet and get the water. And we do not want to have to pay very much for that, and we do not want you to make any messes while you're doing that, and we're going to be very angry if you make any messes for that. So connecting consumption and production and recognizing how complicit and responsible consumers are for the things that they condemn the engineers for, that is really a major goal of the book. Moreover, we need the engineers. We cannot scorn them for their imperial exercises of power over nature, because we need their help to arrange for better practices in the future and also to repair some of the old injuries and disturbances. So some of my best, I often say at this point, no one should have a dinner party without having an engineer there and being gracious and bridge building with that engineer. They're good at bridges, after all, so that's it. And then my last misapprehension, this one was a hard one for me to realize. I had gone on for years about the distinctiveness of the American West. And I had been Stagnerian, Powellian, Zebulon, Pikean, and thinking that it was the water supply that made the American West so distinctive. And then I made an error of self-control, and I looked at the history of the New York water system and the Boston water system. So here is a western town, not often recognized as that. There are rivers. Well, there's a few little streams. There were some springs on Manhattan, but it was not a particularly well-supplied landscape with water. There are rivers on the side, but they're all contaminated with seawater, so that's not so good. So here is the New York City water system, which bears an uncomfortable and uncanny resemblance to the Denver water system. This is not riparian. This is not people using the water that flows right by their vicinity. This is trans-basin diversion. This is the great reach into the Croton watershed in the 1830s and 1840s, and then into the Catskills. So the Croton Dam, again, 1830s, 1840s, very Western conduct of diverting from a distance. And then, good heavens, even Boston, here's another Western town by its water. Here's the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority for Boston, which again goes far out of the vicinity of Boston and reaches into the interior, into rural areas. The Quabbin Reservoir on the far side there actually drowned 2 or 3 little towns, rural towns there, so very much like the Denver system. And this is when the light came up for me. If you have quite a bit of rainfall, and if you have rivers flowing by your site, and you pack a lot of people into that site, you are going to exceed the available water supply, and you're going to need to divert from a distance. So the distinctiveness of the American West took a body blow for me with this, because what has gone on here with Boston and New York, and why were they replicating the West before the West had even done its own diversion? So it's an unsettling thing. So the relevance of Denver's water history to global humanities. Here's a nice cartoon. Okay, fellows, we shoot first, then Q&A. But I will close with a couple of limericks. This is the lessons of interconnection that I mentioned before on the rural and urban thing. Rural and urban places, they're tangled together like laces. They're like sister and brother. They depend on each other. They have never been opposite cases. And I know you won't believe, why would you believe this such a thing? But these limericks, I wrote them this summer for a water conference. They circulated through the Denver Water Department, and they circulated through the Colorado Supreme Court. Now, had they not been limericks, had they been essays or articles, that would never have happened. So, and then here, a final recognition of the unexpected power of an agency like Denver Water to show, I guess, wisdom in an era where we cannot talk about climate change in Washington, D.C., and Congress, or in many other such venues. Denver Water has been leading in the recognition of climate change. Chip Sperry, when he was manager, Jim Lockhead, Chips was killed in an accident 2 years ago. Jim Lockhead, his successor, both of them have said, I've been in the room when they said, when somebody says it's so difficult to talk about climate change because it's so politicized, Jim Lockhead said 2 months ago at a public program, if we don't respond to climate change and put it in our plans, we're irresponsible. So it's the one place where you can go in the United States today to hear people breathing deeply and talking about climate change, not in an agitated, alarmist way, but just saying this has to be reckoned with, which produced this limerick. As the world proceeds to get hotter, the power to predict will soon totter. The baseline's been battered, the norm has been shattered, but everyone still wants their water. So the fate of the great American desert. It made sense, the idea of Western aridity, setting up distinctive conditions. Historical change went in implausible and unexpected directions. The moral of the story, I think, is to counter fatalism, is to not go into a sense that we can see the future and it is grim or it comes with these knowable, definable boundaries and constraints and limits. I end with a story that I guess again shows me finding inspiration in invaders and intruders into the West. Alfred Jacob Miller was a painter in the West in the 1830s, and his patron was Sir William Drummond Stewart, who was a Scottish nobleman, and they were in the Rockies, and they came up on a river in spring flood, in the spring runoff, and Sir William Drummond Stewart barely stopped. He led his party straight into this river. The river was really in flood. There were logs coming down the river, and just a very dangerous situation to jump in there. So they raced into the river. Alfred Jacob Miller raced in behind William Drummond Stewart. The rest of the party came and they floundered across the river. The horses were floundering. They were horses, and they were separated. The horses made it to the other side. The men floundered across. And when they came up on the opposite bank, Alfred Jacob Miller, the painter, said to his patron, William Drummond Stewart, "Why did you do that?" And he said then, next to Lord Stewart, he said, "You do know that I do not know how to swim." And Sir William Drummond Stewart said, "Well, neither do I." He said, "You know not what you can do until you have tried." And that is a proposition that applies to counter the fatalism, to counter the sense of the conviction of inevitability that strikes us sometimes. That is a proposition. You know not what you can do until you have tried. That applies to communities, societies, as much as it does to individuals. So, thank you.
If you have any questions, please speak in the microphone.
I suppose the moral of that story is it's important to learn to swim when you have the chance to, which So, okay, so now we're ready with the mic. Okay, questions? There are some well-read folks in this audience who actually know this book.
Professor, I imagine most of the water comes from the snow from the mountains, the runoff in the spring.
Right.
And imagine that's a major source because there's not a lot of precipitation out there. But isn't Colorado out there? They get quite a bit. I mean, I was out in the mountains of California, and it was nothing to get dumped on 4 feet in a night of snow and everything. And is that their only source? I know around here in Maine, some out in the rural areas, they can drill down. People can get their own individual water under the surface. Do they have that opportunity out there at all?
Yes, well, you're quite right that it is mostly runoff from winter snow. And the bad news about that is that the snowpack varies a lot in depth. And this drought of 2002, the snowpack was very, very light. And Denver water's reservoirs were drawn down 50%. It was scary. So the fear of global warming, or the fears raised by global warming, is that there will be less snowfall and more rain. So less snowpack to provide that runoff. And it is the headwaters of 4 or 5 major rivers. So when Colorado has that problem, it's really a big one. So yes, the snowpack is the key, but it is not a very reliable key. Most communities in the nation really started with groundwater. So that's why New York had a long spell before they did the Croton diversion, because they could do wells and groundwater. But then that's not great if a bunch of people are living on wells and groundwater, as they did in Denver too, but they are also having, we'll just call them sewage issues at the same time. So the groundwater is not improved by having a lot of human beings with sanitary issues going on that. So that's where groundwater is a workable short-term solution in areas of the West. What's extremely ironic right now is that Denver Water has proposed expanding Gross Reservoir, which is in Boulder County in a rural area, which has a lot of people living there who have moved in there in the last 20, 25 years because they love the beautiful mountain scenery. So they are condemning Denver Water for not living sustainably and expanding the reservoir to store more diversion from the western slope. Those people are living on groundwater. Those people are living on an unreplenished source of water there. So it's a little bit comical when they lecture Denver Water on sustainability. So yeah, there is groundwater. The county to the south of Denver, Douglas County, has been the fastest growing county in the United States. The last 20 or 30 years, it was either number 1 or number 2 or number 3. They have almost no surface water claims, so they have been pumping water much faster than it could be replenished. So yes, people were using groundwater, but it is not a great long-term solution. In fact, it's a really dangerous one. Now there's a whole part of this big global agreement is that Denver will give treated water to the county that has been trying to get by on groundwater. That, I just called it treated water, but the usual phrase is toilet to tap, which is not an attractive phrase, but if that's the only water you have in Douglas County, that's, so it is much more than any one variable, but the groundwater is not, I don't think there's any place in the West really where it's being replenished at a great and trustworthy rate.
Throughout the country, there are hundreds of dams that are deteriorating, and I'm just curious as to what the age and the impact of that is on this water system.
That's a really great question. That's one of the reasons why I've enjoyed collaborating with the engineers on my campus. because durability, well, an engineer would say infrastructure has durability problems. A historian hears that as an engineer saying history is important. So if you're working with biologists, you need to say anthropogenic change. Then they go, oh, history, that's, well, you don't have to tell them it's history. So the durability thing really causes the engineers to think very seriously about change over time, which throws them into the company of historians, whether that was their plan or not. So I am amazed. I think the Bureau of Reclamation dams, some of them seem to have really been conceived of in a timeless universe where they would just build them, and that would be that. And of course, the Bureau of Reclamation in the last 20 years, make us a little bit more than that, 30 years, has shifted from building dams to maintaining them, and they're doing an important job on that. I sound like a cheerleader, but Denver Water is doing a major rehab of Cheeseman Dam. They have underwater divers living in a kind of pod under water. They're down there for a month or something so they don't have to keep going back and forth, really checking that dam to make sure there's no danger. Security issues are terrifying for all of these agencies now. When we went on our tour of Denver Water, we had to do it with complete security clearance. We had to be watched all the time. That one dam, Dillon Dam, used to have a county road going over it. And after 9/11, that's been a very difficult thing because the people in the county are very angry if they can't use that road. But the fear, if that dam broke, if there were a terrorist incident with that dam, the Blue River has a lot of residences along the way there, and it would be a very terrible thing. So this puts Denver Water in a bad position because they want to keep Dillon Dam from breaking, and so they try to prohibit cars using that, which then makes the people of the Western Slope angry, even though really I think Denver Water is trying to keep its system functioning, but also keep them from being flooded. So that is really a huge thing about infrastructure and its aging, and the extreme reluctance in the American people to invest in that. A lot of pep in building the things, a lot of, oh boy, now we're going to have a ribbon cutting, oh yay, and then it's 60 years old, it's 70 years old. The whole anti-tax thing, I think that might be the goofiest, sorry to suggest my politics on that one there, but to be so opposed to public expenditures that you risk our common well-being with roads and bridges, and it's not foresighted. But yeah, that's an enormous thing, and I think that Denver has a separate taxing ability. So Denver Water can pass bonds or allocate money without having to go to the voters. So they can pay for that infrastructure maintenance without having to ask the contentious members of Congress to participate in that.
Hi, thank you for the just broad sweeping view of this last 100 years. I'm so curious about, from all that perspective, what are your thoughts going forward? Where do you think we're heading on politics and permitting and security and issues in terms of water quality and quantity and residential density and things in that area? So I don't know, 100 years out.
If Glenn Saunders were still in charge, the fellow who was proud of killing the Indians and would do it again, if Glenn Saunders, who seems like he was a really interesting man, you hear very complicated and interesting testimony to him. I've heard from a number of his friends he was a Shakespearean actor. He was a really colorful and interesting character. And he did give a talk once to an environmental group in Colorado where he said, if you don't control population, it's your doing here, because there will always be guys like me ruining beautiful canyons until you get control of population. So that was an interesting moment. But anyway, if Glenn Saunders were still in charge of Denver Water, I don't know. But Jim Lockhead and Chip Sperry are so different from that. They're so capable of saying it does not work for us to do the it's my way or the highway thing. They're really very collaborative. They are pretty typical of a lot of things going on in the West, and I think in other areas of the country as well. These watershed coalitions where you don't, you kind of get out of the courtrooms and you have endless sessions. The Denver Water Agreement was, I think, 5.5 years of meetings at least once a month, 2-day meetings, and more donuts and coffee than a person could bear. I mean, their cholesterol is a mess because of that. But they just really cut back on the lawsuits and chatted with each other, and that is not atypical of things that are going on. A lot of efforts at restoration, remediation, fish habitat concerns, those things are really happening in very interesting collaboration. So it seems like, and this is the only route to cheer I can offer for myself personally now, because I'm not enjoying the ways of Washington, D.C. now. Those are not uplifting to me. But the further you get from there and the more you get to local communities, it seems like there's really a lot of efforts to solve problems together. And in some cases, they run up against larger constraints and legal obstacles with that. But I will just use one example that I bring to my class, a man named Art Goodtimes, who's a county commissioner in Telluride, San Miguel County. And he is the first Green Party member elected to a county commission in Colorado. So he is a very ardent environmentalist. He's a performance poet. He's very tie-dyed. His hair is a little longer, or if he had more hair, it would be longer than mine. So he was elected county commissioner for a Western Slope County, and within days, or within minutes really, of his being elected, he said, well, now I represent a lot of people who are not Green Party members. I represent a lot of conservative Republican ranchers. I am their representative. I must go meet them. I must go find out what they want said. And so Art Goodtimes has been reelected several times, and is just, his given name is not Goodtimes. It's a hippie manifestation to have changed his name in that direction. So I bring him to my class just to, at one point in the Western American Studies class, to say, this goes beyond anything you would predict. When you see him at county commissioner meetings, all the county commissioners are pretty darn, their hair is quite short, and over on the far side is Art Goodtimes in tie-dye. At first I thought he was crocheting. I thought, well, that's curious. None of the other county commissioners are crocheting, but then I realized he's actually weaving funny hats, colorful round hats that he wears. So, but it's kind of neat because after a day when the rest of us have nothing to show except notes for sitting all day, he's got several nice hats. But he gets reelected, and he was very active, and he's often in Washington lobbying on behalf of Western County issues. So that's a long-winded way of saying that seems a lot better to put your attention towards those local communities. There's a spectacular woman, Lynn Scarlett, who was Deputy Secretary of Interior in the George W. Bush administration, and she was everywhere around the country, not just in the West, working with these groups, with these locally based collaborative conservation groups. And my dream is that Lynn will, in the next year or two, publish a book with her testimony on how just really everywhere she went. She has a wonderful story about a crabby farmer in Pennsylvania who didn't want to talk about there was an endangered species issue. He would just shut the curtains when he saw the Fish and Wildlife Service car pull into his driveway. Then Lynn's there, she's chatting with him. They start a conversation. She comes back a few months later. I think I'm getting the story more or less right. And she sees the crabby old farmer, and she's chatting with him. He's not particularly crabby. And he suddenly says, oh, look, there's a red-bellied something or other, some kind of bird there. And she says, oh, how did you happen to know that? And he said, oh, the Fish and Wildlife people gave me this bird book, and I've been studying up on that. I mean, that's just, it's a very small tokenistic kind of thing. But she has stories of much greater substance than just recognizing birds. So Lynn Scarlett, if you've never met her or heard her or seen her, I really recommend that you check her out, because she has been on site and in many cases initiating these kinds of collaborations. So if that's not the hope for the future, then I don't know where we would find it, except that fortunately the baby boomers are headed to the sunset. That's kind of good news, because the baby boomers got a little bit stuck in some customs of the 1960s. I started college in 1968, and very funny that the people we used to call the 60s people are now in their 60s. That's pretty funny, the 1960s and 60s. So I just think that a lot of the young folks in the room will not be carrying out some of the nonsense that their elders got really committed to, of the polarized stuff. So, yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for your lecture. And my question is, so the rise of environmentalism, say, in the 1970s, really influenced the way that some agencies carried out their management. For example, in the Forest Service, ecological principles have definitely been a cornerstone in some respects of management of, say, some of the national forests. Do you see a similar story playing out with Denver water, that ecological principles likewise started to become guidelines for how water has been managed?
Thank you for that question. Yes, indeed, because part of this agreement that was just announced in April of 2011, Denver Water provides both money and, if the courts will let them do this, water rights for aquatic systems remediation, so there would be more water released according to the seasonal needs. The headwaters counties get just direct money for environmental remediation, so they have really made a big move. Now, here's where the problem comes, and I think this is true for the Forest Service as well as Denver Water. If outdoor science could provide results that were as precise as indoor laboratory science, this would all be a lot easier. But outdoor science is so full of variables that are not controllable as they might be in a laboratory. So Denver Water has agreed to have more seasonal releases, that the Fraser River would be the one affected by increased diversion, but they would try to time it, they would try to rechannelize the river so that it wasn't as spread out, and so the temperature would be cooler and so on. But the opponents to this plan say that's not going to work because the Fraser River is at a threshold, and any diversion will take that into calamity. It's just teetering on the phase change thing there. Well, I don't know if that's true. Different scientists have different judgments of that as well. They might, because they're going to be Zebulon Pike and Stephen Long in a moment. They're going to be making a firm prediction that's not knowable. So I think for the Forest Service and for, well, really Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, Denver Water, Fish and Wildlife, the difficulty of doing ecosystem science with that kind of precision. If you take 3,000 acre feet in early June, you will have these, I mean, it's so unbelievably multivariate. And that would be true without climate change. And then the whole problem of scaling down from patterns that seem quite clear at the atmospheric level to get that scale down to the watershed affected by Denver Water, that's really hard. So even though I think it's had an enormous impact, ecological science and the environmental laws of the 1960s and 1970s, it's really hard to implement that in a precise and clear way when so many different stakeholders and elected officials are tugging at you and pulling at you and condemning you. And Lynn Scarlett has this figured out, though, I'm happy to tell you. Lynn is actually really great at navigating through this and helping people just arrive at the right calculation of what can be said with certainty and where you go into speculation, and where you have to do the thing of adaptive management, where you have to say, we expected this result, we got the opposite, we need to, in some fairly nimble way, recalibrate on that. But nimble, oh my goodness, nimble for an agency like that, oh boy. So, yeah.
In one of my courses, we discussed a case study regarding a woman who was arrested for collecting rainwater in the West. And I was just wondering if you thought this issue would become more prevalent and what your personal thoughts on it were.
Right. Well, that's the whole prior appropriation system, that rainwater, which seems to be falling freely to the earth, is already headed towards somebody's water right. And so if you jump in there with your barrel, you are appropriating water that somebody else, it was supposed to hit the ground and head towards that downstream rights holder. So it's understandable how that happened. As I understand it, the Colorado legislature did pass a law recently that offers a little variation in that you can make some kind of special application and show how you're going to use it. And in truth, if you're watering your plants, it's going back into the water system. But that is one of the things that at first makes no sense. How could a person not have, if they own the land, why do they not own the water that falls on that land or have the right to use it before it goes downstream? Well, because there's a 150-year-old system of prior appropriation that says you can't do that. There's so many ways in which the concept of property has been put through extreme stress in the American West, and this would be one, but maybe the wilder one, is the separation of the ranch owner under the 1916 Homestead or Stock Raising Act. That separates the ownership of the land, the surface of the ranch, from the subsurface mineral rights, and those you can develop whether you have the consent of the landowner. Anyway, we have many cases where the concept of property has just been stretched to where it's such improbability. This is a really interesting one. My impression is that the engineers, there are reasons why I'm fans of them. I've heard several engineers give talks about how you can create these things that are water gardens, basically. You take where the downspout is coming from the roof, and you put plants that would not otherwise be supportable if you were just going to irrigate them, and the water comes in and lands on that, which is basically ground prepared to hold the water and to retain it for those plants. So that's not a barrel, so it's not a violation of the thing, but it's just a form of landscaping that retains the water on your land. I suppose you could, if you're careful about where the downspout hits, you could have your tomatoes there, you could do that kind of gardening. So there's a recognition, I know in the state of Colorado, that that's a thing that makes sense to people. I will not use water from the diversions of the western slope. I'll use what just falls on my land. It makes perfect sense, except that it just runs into this very complex legal structure. That's probably back to the question of the future. Is there flexibility in that legal structure? Because Denver Water has concerns about whether they'll be able to put more water into the Fraser River at seasonal ways without jeopardizing the whole holding of rights and that. So can the courts be adaptable in that is really a big question. But it's a great bellwether thing to watch and to see that would happen. And it is one of those things that once you get closer to it, you can think, oh yeah, that is a genuine tangle. If you're thinking a woman got arrested or charged with a misdemeanor or something because she tried to water her plants from a barrel? Is that society come to that? Don't let the Tea Party know about this, I guess, because this would be an incredible case for them. But as you get into the functioning of that, you can kind of understand how that puzzle came upon us.
I have a question. Could you foresee in the future as like a possibility that sort of say it's similar to like an international highway system to make a correlation? Could you picture like a water system? This would be a feat of amazing engineering, but one where water travels through pipes or different systems in between all areas of the country, maybe even using some of the water systems we already have, and like through like toilets and like recycling water. So it could be transported like from Maine, where we might have like an excess of water over the year, to possibly to the southwest, just through different like lines of water communication. That way, areas that do have surpluses of water could be shared with other parts of the country. And I know it would take quite a feat of just litigation and legal standing to do that.
Right. Well, that question comes up. Pat Mulroy is the head of the water district that Las Vegas is a part of. And she, contrary to what you might think when you hear Las Vegas, she is one of the most aggressive water conservationists on the planet, really. Under her guidance, leadership, Las Vegas pays people for every square foot of lawn they take out. You get a financial reward for that. So she's remarkable on that, but she's also wanting to make sure she has water in the future. So she has proposed, she's one of several who've proposed, when you look at, I'm sorry, I'm not laughing because it's a very sad thing, but if there's scarcity in the West of water, and the Missouri and the Mississippi are flooding and creating calamities in the Mississippi Valley and the Missouri Valley, it's not wacky to think, boy, they've got too much and we've got too little. So Pat Mulroy has proposed that the water from the Mississippi and the Missouri get diverted to the Front Range of Colorado. Front Range of Colorado wouldn't then be taking the water from the western slope. That water would stay in the Colorado River, would go to Las Vegas. So she's got that idea. There were ideas in the 1960s about diverting from the Yukon and from other areas of Alaska. Because Pike and Long we're so certain and we're so wrong, I'm reluctant myself to say, oh, that can't happen. But what I think has really changed, and maybe it will change again, but that hostility to public spending is so strong, that investment in infrastructure that was so crucial to creating these systems, I don't see that kind of giant project happening because I can't see the American people saying, oh, we'll pay for that. Oh, tax us, we'll pay for that. So that seems to be the real boundary. People say, knowledgeable people say, that's why the Bureau of Reclamation stopped building big dams, not really because of environmental objection, but because Ronald Reagan's budget director, David Stockman, said, that's not a sensible use of taxpayer money to benefit a few people with that. So what is an interesting thing, there's a new book, Alex Prudhomme's book on freshwater issues, concludes, and he wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times about having a national water policy. At least we could do that instead of this fragmented contesting empires. Then he concludes by saying, can't we coordinate this as a nation? We don't have a national energy policy necessarily or any other sort of, I guess we have a public lands policy with national parks. But anyway, so he concluded with that. I happened to be leading a discussion with the Colorado Supreme Court justice who's the expert on water and the Denver water manager just after that came out. And I said, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about this idea of a national water policy? And both of those guys just looked at me and said, non-starter. That's a non-starter. And based on what I just said about the things that local people can do in negotiation with each other, things can happen on a state level or even on a county level that are future-oriented, that are adaptable, and it just does not seem that the national government, the federal government at this point has that capacity. Congress doesn't have that. So I think probably not. But to be thinking system-wide, to be thinking about the whole continent, that's a wonderful. If it's attached to federal money, I don't know what that turns into. But if it's people thinking in the broadest picture of North America and its needs, that seems really exciting. And I hope the post-baby boomer young folks would go in that direction.
We have one more question.
You touched on this before you began to review the book project, the graph showing how much water in each state is allocated to agriculture and how much is allocated to the urban areas. So Denver Water finds itself in a position where it's looking for how can it enhance its resources to supply future growth, and it's working with the top piece of that graph. Your story didn't talk about it because I presume that Denver Water hasn't yet pursued much in the way of acquiring rights from agricultural users, but what do the trends seem to be in the present going into the future for that?
Yeah, Denver Water is kind of unusual among Western water organizations in not having done much in that direction. I actually thought they were thinking about it. Chip Sperry used to talk about it, but apparently they didn't go in that direction because they didn't need to, because they were clever people in the early 20th century. I mean, they have a lot of senior water rights, so there was no need to do that. The wise people thinking about this seem to say, can we shift from the finality of taking an agricultural water right and buying it and moving it permanently to a city? Do we have to do it that way? Could we have, it's often good for land to lie fallow, so could you have an arrangement where the farm retains the water right in years of abundant flow, and when there is a drought, the water goes to the city, is sort of leased to the city, but the farmer doesn't have to retire and pack up and deprive us of a source of food and fiber, so that you just have some accommodation and flexibility built into it. And could you also increase the efficiency of agricultural water use? Because a lot of ditches just distribute water not to any known crop, but to just leakage into the environment. So could you have better ditch liners, and could the water that is then sort of saved and harvested be available to cities? So I think that's the wise people's direction, is how can you keep this from being either urban well-being or rural well-being, and put those two together. And I think Denver Water is now thinking of that, but a lot of other communities have gone much further. And in some ways, the phrase that's used is buy and dry, which doesn't seem great. If it's really dewatering farmland, because the open spaces are so important to the appeal of the West, and a bunch of scabby places with a bunch of tumbleweeds, that's not what makes people love the West.
Thank you so
Oh,
much,
thank you.
Professor
Thank
Limerick.
you.